We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining me once again is our good friend, Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He has written a bunch of books. I want to get to our conversation. I'm not going to do the long introduction because you know him already. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, RJ. Glad to be here.
So look, I have been, as always, following the newspapers, both the so-called business section as well as the front page and politics. First of all, I will note in passing that the business section, every paper has a business section. No paper has a labor section. Just a little parenthetical comment there, even though a lot of more people are workers than business people. It kind of shows you where they're coming from. So the business pages are telling us that the economy is looking good. It's green lights all the way. The politics pages are telling us that Joe Biden and the Democrats' big challenge is helping people understand how good the economy is for them now that, you know, unemployment, some of the inflation indicators are softening, but which is good, but unemployment hasn't gone way up. And, you know, so all the indicators that they use are good, but people don't feel good, I don't think. And they're puzzling and scratching their heads. How do we get them to understand that the economy is good? And it seems to me, if people don't think the economy is good, something isn't good. So I guess the topic, and I know you've thought about this a lot, so I guess if I were to give a short name to our topic, I would say, if the economy is so good, how come I feel so bad? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let me begin by pointing out that Harvard University sends out to an email list every week, or maybe even a bit more often. You know, it's PR. I'm assuming these are mostly Harvard professors who write little stories. And so if you're interested to hear what's going on among the people at Harvard, you subscribe to this little newsletter. And as an alumnus, I get it. And if I weren't an alumnus, I would not have subscribed. But in any case, I get it. And the latest issue puts it, your point, this way. The numbers, the economic numbers, are all good. But people feel bad. Is it a moodiness? And how do we explain the moody, that's the word they use, moodiness of people? And, you know, as happens fairly often when I glance through this letter from Harvard, I'm reminded that Harvard is like all the other universities. It just spends more on self-promotion, that what comes out of there is stunningly mediocre most of the time. Anyway, this is an example of mediocrity. It is a bald-faced effort to suggest that there's a hard, objective reality, the numbers, which say the economy is good, and then there are the flaky people who are in a bad mood and therefore miss out on how the reality actually is. And this is an insult to people, myself included, and so the reaction is a bit predictable. And I would put it this way. If you don't feel well and you go to a doctor and they ask the doctor to examine you and so forth because you really don't feel well, what would you say to a doctor who came back and said, I took your temperature, I took your blood pressure, those are really good, and therefore your numbers show you're healthy, please go home and stop bothering me with your moodiness about not feeling well? Well,
I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'll just say I think there are a lot of women in this country who've gone to male doctors and had that very experience, and they don't appreciate it.
Yes, lucky for them. They have seen through the charade. But hopefully you'd never go to such a doctor again, because you know, as most people do, that to assess the health of the human body requires lots and lots of numbers, not just your temperature and your blood pressure, but the composition of your blood, the composition of your urine, all the things that a competent doctor would assess. He would gather, or she would gather, many numbers. And typically, like 99% of the time, some of those numbers would show, well, you're healthy. And other numbers would show you got some problems. And then what you're paying the doctor for is the experience and the education to know how to balance the different numbers to come up with something that's a useful assessment, since human bodies are always going through complicated shifts and changes anyway. Well, it's exactly the same with the economy. It's like the human body. If you want an assessment of the economy, you have to look at a lot of numbers. What that Harvard economist did was look at 2, 3, 4, and those are the same ones that Mr. Biden is pointing to, and that the commercial press and the business sections are all celebrating. And here, let's mention them. A low unemployment rate, a falling rate of inflation, and there are others. Those point in directions most of us would think are pretty good. But there are loads of other numbers that don't point that way. I'll give you a few examples of those. We are now coming on to 30 to 40 years of a widening gap between the rich and the poor. And the last 5 years have seen an extreme worsening of all of that because of the inflation, because of the crash associated with the pandemic, and so on. That's an important number, inequality. It has made revolutions in the history of the world. It has undercut economic systems left and right. That's a number we ought to talk about. Here's another one. The level of debt in our society. Government debt, corporate debt, and household debt are all at out of control record levels. That creates a vulnerability that a crash or a downturn anywhere in this debt-connected system completely ramifies. It's like an explosion that happens because one person's difficulty means they can't repay their debt. One company's difficulty, they can't repay their debt, which throws into difficulty the creditors who lent them the money. Oh, that has to be evaluated. We just announced yesterday, the Treasury Department, that we're going to have, if things continue the way they are for the rest of this year, a governmental deficit back over $1 trillion, much higher than it was, for example, last year. Okay, what about all of that? Normally, the way we handle a deficit is you borrow the money. Someone has to lend it if the government is going to spend more than it takes in taxes. Well, one of the chief creditors of this country over the last 30 years has been the People's Republic of China. Well, they're not doing that anymore. You know, you send the Seventh Fleet out there to the South China Sea, and you make lots of noise about Taiwan and all the rest. And guess what? Over the last few years, I'm talking 3, 4, 5 years, they've reduced their holding of the bonds of the United States. That's what you get when you lend money to the United States government. They've reduced it from $1.3 trillion to $800 billion. That's an enormous refusal to lend, not just refusal to make new loans, but selling those bonds because they don't have confidence that the United States' economy will honor their debts. Whoa. That's what we call a really bad signal. Now, any assessment of the American economy that pretends that the 4 I just gave you and there are many more I could give you if we had the time, somehow don't matter. They can't do that. And so they take the cheap shot. The numbers are good. The people are moody. No, they're not. The people are looking at many more indicators than you dare to acknowledge. So we'll have Janet Yellen telling us how she's concerned about inequality in a speech given to, I don't know, whoever invites her. Meanwhile, she tells the business press what good shape our economy is in. Wow, how convenient. When she tells the people how good the economy is, she forgets the very speech she made about inequality being a problem, and she's unusual to even be doing that. So I think what we got here is an economy that is actually very ambiguous, having as many negatives as positives, having really serious negatives that in many ways are more important indicators. But we have a media and politicians and academics who simply want us to be fooled, like that doctor in my story, that if your blood pressure is down and your whatever else is up, you're healthy and I don't have to do all of those difficult tests and then that complicated weighing of the different signs, the different empirical data that are necessary to come up with anything worthwhile in the way of an assessment.
So your comments then, they really functioned on two levels, the macro and the micro. And I think that's great because I think people need to understand how the macro affects their lives. And I want to get to that in a second. But first, I do want to talk a little bit about the individual experience of the economy, which is, I could use a couple metaphors. One would be to use your doctor analogy. If I'm running a high temperature and then I break my leg and the doctor goes, your leg is fixed. Great. Go home. And I say, well, I'm still sick. Okay, fine. I got a good leg. Or maybe even better analogy. If I'm drowning because I'm 6 feet underwater and I faintly through the bubbling water hear somebody say, good news. You're only 3 feet underwater now. That's not such good news because I'm still drowning. And if they say, oh, but at this rate in an hour, you'll be above water. That's not good news either because I require oxygen within 3 minutes or I'm going to die. So we have people who are underwater financially. We have people who, as you mentioned, are in debt. We have people who can't keep up with their bills, don't have $500 for an emergency or what have you. We have, chronic unemployment. We have all these other factors affecting people's lives. And I think the idea that we get back to the sort of halcyon days of 2015 or something is nuts because to me, the base, state, or whatever, the default state of working people in this country is not very good. So I think that, these measurements, leaving aside even for a second the trend lines, what have you, the measurements, I think they ignore, when Janet Yellen talks about inequality, well, then she doesn't act about the implications of inequality, which are not just this year's indicators. That's a long-term problem. And so I could go on, but to me, it's mistaking the superficial trend lines for the Troy Miller, producer, always tells me I can't swear online, but for the fundamentally crappy state of working America. Am I off base?
Not at all. Not at all. If I can play on my own words here, the mood, if you like, of Mr. Biden and the mood of those who don't want to see or face or analyze the serious problems of American capitalism, their mood is to celebrate. And their mood, therefore, leads them to focus on variables, to focus on indices that are positive. I understand that. That's the way their mood directs them. But if you're going to call other people who disagree with you about the economy moody, what you're effectively doing is suggesting that you aren't guided by your moods when you do an assessment, which is a straight out lie. Even the greatest economists have always understood that the numbers don't solve anything. They're too ambiguous and there are too many of them, so that there has to be a judgment. Which ones do we look at? How do we interpret them? The greatest economist of the 20th century was John Maynard Keynes, who was not only a great economist at Cambridge University in England, but was also a major policymaker who created the Bretton Woods system that governed the Western world for most of the second half of the 20th century, and so on. He studied the economy, particularly the ups and downs of the business cycle. And what he came to was the numbers are always, if I'm paraphrasing, and I have taught his work all my life, the numbers are always ambiguous. So in the end, he said, you know what makes the economy rise and fall? He came up with the following words: animal spirits. I kid you not. That was his phrase, made famous by him in his book, The General Theory, because he needed to show that in the end, if businessmen and women invest and therefore buoy the economy up, it's because of the, dare I say, mood that they're in. Whatever the spirits, their animal spirits lead them. And a depression, when their spirits say bad times are coming, when they are not feeling positive about the future. In the end, his research, highly technical, highly mathematical, and so on, ended it up in a place which very conveniently Harvard has decided is a quality affecting the people who are critical of our economy, but is not encumbering those who celebrate it.
Well, Animal Spirits would be a great name for a punk band, but don't let me get distracted by that. You raise a great point, which is, you read again the business section of the newspaper, and you hear this stock, this is up, this stock is down, based on perceptions, right? Perceptions of what's going to happen to it, or a general panic. Sometimes you hear that word among investors about medium-sized banks, let's say, or what have you, after Silicon Valley Bank. It's like, well, that's a nutty way to run an economic system right there. But also I wanted to bring up that I would venture to say that a lot of the people who write and read that Harvard newsletter you're talking about are Hillary Clinton Democrats, and or would prefer to see that, what word should I use, that subculture, professional subculture, retain its influence and power. And not that I'm a big fan of Larry Kudlow or whoever else Trump would bring in, but this is the Democrats, establishment Democrats, for example, big on these traditional economists. What they say they fear most is the return of re-election of Donald Trump. But it seems to me the sheer, I can't come up with the polite words of this, the snottiness of a word like moodiness, the sort of condescension, I guess is the word I would use.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Condescension is exactly what sank Hillary Clinton and some other Democrats in 2016. People sense it. They get that it's wrong. They get that it's a character defect on the part of the condescending person rather than their own, and they react to it. And it seems to me the reason why I think the Democrats are deeply misguided to want to run on the successes of the economy, that's what Hillary Clinton did in 2016. She said 4 more, and then she dropped it as an angle, but vote for me if you want another a Barack Obama term. Things are going so well. Well, you know what? Things were not going so well. They were going so badly that Trump was able to get it within shouting distance of winning the popular vote, enough so that he won the electoral vote. So it seems to me that this whole notion that people are just too dim-witted to understand how good they have it. If you look at the Gini coefficient that measures inequality, if you look at the tens of millions of people still in poverty, if you look at the struggles of working people in this country, if you look at the fact that the minimum wage hasn't gone up, if you look at the fact that a 2-bedroom apartment is out of reach, I mean, we could go on forever. But the point is, it don't seem so great, I guess. And I'm sorry to rant, but it seems to me that the element of condescension is a critical part of breaking down what our commentariat and our policy experts get wrong. Do you agree with that?
I agree with it, but let me add something. I think there is a real psychological injury that is involved here that many people, I think, don't get. If the daily radio, television, newspaper, social media are constantly blaring how good the economy is, but you as a member of the audience reading or watching or listening to this, your life is in trouble. Your job is insecure. The work you do is horrible. The money you get, isn't sufficient. What happens when you keep being told the economy is great, but you aren't in great economic shape? Well, if you're a good American, you turn that in and blame yourself.
Yeah.
You don't understand what's going on in the larger economic world. You don't understand what ideological game that you've beautifully summarized here is being played on you. And you wonder what's the matter with me that I'm not enjoying the good economy that apparently everybody else is, just a few of us like me. And then, your visits to the bar might go up and you're looking for an escape from facing this very hurtful story over and over again. Wow. This does real damage to people's self-esteem, people's ability to get up and try again, people's sense of themselves, people who are upset and take it out on their children or their pets. This is very damaging. And it has to be understood that it's not only that it isn't true, but it has very hurtful consequences in a larger population.
I think that's so important. And, back in 2009, 2010, I was writing for the Huffington Post, big platform. And even though other people took the story and went further with it, I was one of the first people to talk about foreclosure fraud on the part of the banks and how banks were cheating and lying people. And I got multiple emails and messages from people, 3 of whom said they were contemplating suicide because they didn't one of them, a single mother, who said, I felt I had failed my 8-year-old son and myself. And, this information made me realize it wasn't my fault. The brutality of this belief that's inflicted on people carries, you're so right, a terrible psychic price. And yet, what's most horrifying is that it serves the interest of the financial elites for people to feel this way. It's much better that they turn this anger in them than for the 40, I added it up. I did some projections, 40 million people among all the families who are facing foreclosure. Then if you take each household and it's 2.5 or whatever, 40 million people suffering. If all those 40 million people, because of underwater mortgages at the time, realized that it wasn't their fault, Wall Street would be in trouble. There would be a political force threatening it. So how good for them that people suffer and blame themselves, right?
Yes. And how much we have every right to hold them accountable, not just for misreading the economy to fit their particular mood and denouncing those of us that are critical as if we were the moody ones and they had magically escaped. But we should also hold them accountable for the real damage and hurt they inflict on people. You know, there are, in the history of psychology, there are professors who made studies. I remember one, I believe, at Swarthmore College, who got into trouble because they had a student, if I remember the experiment correctly, leave the room to do an errand. And while the student was out of the room, the professor said to the rest of the students, when the student who's out of the room returns, I'm going to show you some lines on a screen. And there'll be 3 lines, and one of them will be clearly shorter than the other 2. And I'm going to ask you to say, is it line number 1 or 2 or 3 that's shorter? And I want you always to pick the longest one, which you can identify, when I ask you for the shorter one. Because the person coming back, not being in on the instruction, is going to say it's number 2 because it's the shortest one, but everybody else in the class will say something else. Well, what the professor discovered was the students broke down, that one student, after a very few minutes of this procedure, because they thought their eyesight was or their brain was falling apart, or they had some fundamental learning I mean, you did real, and he got into trouble, the professor, for doing such an experiment because, yeah, it showed how much we are all swayed by the people around us, but it also showed what kind of damage you can do to a person, especially if there's no explanation in 10 minutes of how this was done and arranged, so you can recoup a little bit of what you lost in terms of self-confidence. So, I mean, it's a game we're playing in our society, but it doesn't stop after 10 minutes. It's continual. It's constantly going on. And if people really understand what we're saying here, RJ, then don't limit it to the question of the economy. Assessing, for example, how a war is going is just as complicated, with just as many ambiguous numbers pointing in opposite directions. So it's very hard to come to a conclusion. But if all you hear is that one side is winning and the other one is losing, you're being hustled. You're not being explained anything. You do not know what's going on any more than you would understand the American economy if you read the business section of the New York Times every day, because that's not an analysis. That's a celebration by cheerleaders.
That you're talking about cognitive dissonance. You're talking about what happens when everybody says one thing and you see and feel another. It drives you insane. And you're right, absolutely true. In terms of war, and that gets me back to the other thing I wanted to mention, which was the macro picture. In terms of war, for example, Joe Biden goes on TV and says about the Nord Stream or whatever pipeline from Russia to Norway, well, we have ways of taking care of that, and believe me, we'll do it. Then it blows up, and all the newspapers say the Russians blew it up themselves. So they blew up their own pipeline. They could just turn it off if they, and everybody goes, what? And then 6 months later, they say, well, no, we don't think the Russians, blew it. So, but I mean, you talked about on the macro level, for example, and I thought this was important. The Chinese have less confidence in our government's financial, ability or willingness to pay off its own debts. That's going to have, so from 1.3 trillion, it goes to what you said, 800 billion, I think. So it's 40%, give or take. Cut. That's a big deal. It's a lot of money. It's going to affect a lot of things that people might not realize in their daily lives. And, nobody is drawing the connection for them of, well, we kept the Afghan bank's money, even though it's not ours. And we said, we're going to do something else with it. And we sanctioned all this money from Russia, and we sanctioned this money from Iran. And so, you know what? People don't trust us besides our fiscal stability. People don't trust us, as the sort of, we run the like global digital banking system, right? SWIFT. The dollar is the world global current, economy is denominated to the dollar, whatever. Well, all of a sudden, if we start saying, well, we're not going to honor these commitments because we're going to use money as a weapon of war, well, then maybe people won't want to do business with us. And maybe this is another way that, our lives are being affected. And maybe people hear about it and think, yeah, there's something wrong about that. But nobody tells them what it is. So they just have this disquiet. You get what I'm driving at?
Absolutely. I mean, when I teach this stuff, I say to them, imagine you lived in a community and there was a bank, 2 or 3 banks, and you banked at number one bank. And then there was a headline in the newspaper that bank decided that some part of the community is being morally lax in some way. They are performing abortions and they shouldn't, or they're not performing abortions and they should. The point is not what the disagreements are, but now the bank is deciding whose money they will keep for themselves because they've imputed bad behavior on the other. This is not a court of law. This is not a trial. Nothing has been done to allow the different perspectives. And it was the whole community's assumption that whatever disagreements we have, whatever political struggles we go through, my $500 in that bank is my money and I can get it. And yours, even though you disagree with me, you have 500 and you can get your. If you've discovered that this is no longer true, if your bank was picking sides, you'd get your money out of that bank because you'd have the deep understanding that, God forbid, at some moment, you will have an opinion that some bank you're banked in doesn't like. You don't want this. You want to have something else. And you're absolutely right. All over the world, there's been a reaction. And let me tell you, as a professor, we are losing graduate students that used to come to the United States for their graduate education, for that matter, their undergraduate too. They're not coming. They're not coming because their governments are fighting with the United States. They have been given to understand that if they're Asian or Muslim, they won't be welcome, or large parts of the United States will look upon them as though they were dangerous or evil or so. And the cost to us is enormous. We benefit from those students coming here. They learn about the United States. They often stay here, and they're among the best educated people in the world, on and on. And all of that is being lost for the short-term political gain of demonizing some other country. This is the behavior of desperate people, not people thinking straight about what is best for them.
And as we started with, we can conclude with, the lives of working people in this country not being as great as we're being told they are. I can't even imagine what would happen if the countries of the world eventually said, we've had enough of this. We're not going to peg our economies to the dollar anymore. We're going to, I'm sure they're doing less of it already, but we're not going to trade in dollars anymore. We're done with you guys. I can't imagine what that would do to working people in America.
Yeah, it will affect every dimension of their lives. And before we end, let me tell you, the latest count, 121 countries. There only are about 200 of countries in the world. 121 countries have already taken some kind of step to do what they all call de-dollarize. In other words, either change their laws or their rules or their regulations or how they hold the reserves that back up their currency, whatever it is. Some have gone very far. Saudi Arabia is selling oil for other currencies. It's not requiring that they be paid in dollars, as they have done for the last decades. An enormous favor to the United States. The world is shifting. The BRICS countries are developing an alternative currency. It'll probably be pegged to gold because that's what those countries have faith in, because they don't have faith in the dollar. That's already a reality. And the BRICS countries taken together produce about 1/3 of the output of the world today. Whereas the G7, that's the United States, Western Europe, Canada, and Japan, they produce about 29%. In other words, China and its allies already are a bigger economic unit than the United States and its major allies. These realities are being responded to by anger, saber rattling, proxy wars, all kinds of stuff that are not solving anything. If anything, they're making the problem worse. And the American people will be the ones who have to foot the bill for all of this. And in fact, that's what's been going on. The inflation was a tremendous decline of the standard of living of the American working people. And they all know it. They know how they feel in the grocery store or in the department store. The old joke about how there's too much month at the end of the money is a joke everybody tells everybody else, because it's almost a universal experience, except for those at the very top who, after all, read the business section of the New York Times and be told the comforting news that the economy is in great shape.
Well, I don't know how else to conclude except with the John Prine song, "That's How Every Empire Ends." So I fear or expect that we are seeing a kind of spiral in the end of American dominance, and the reaction to it is only going to inflame it. So, but that's my concluding thought. And with that, Richard Wolff, economist, economic historian, host of Economic Update. As always, great pleasure speaking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program. My pleasure as well, RJ. And I'm looking forward to doing it again soon. As am I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.